M. Bartley Seigel lives in Houghton in the Keweenaw Peninsula in Michigan's western Upper Peninsula in the Ojibwe homelands and Treaty of 1842 territory on the shores of Lake Superior. He received his MA from Pennsylvania State University, University Park, and a bachelor's degree in journalism from Eastern Michigan University in Ypsilanti. He's the author of This Is What They Say from Typecast Publishing, published in 2013. And his poetry has regularly appeared in journals such as Poetry Magazine, About Place, Fourth River, Michigan Quarterly Review, Split Rock Review, and Thrush, as well as numerous others. He's been anthologized in the anthology And Here, 100 Years of Upper Peninsula Writing, 1917 to 2017, from Michigan State University Press. And he's been anthologized in Rewilding, Poems for the Environment, from Flexible Press. He's the founding editor-in-chief of the new poetry letterpress, Simple Machines Magazine, and founding editor emeritus of Pank Magazine, which he co-edited with Roxane Gay from 2006 to 2015. He's associate professor of creative writing and the Writing Center director in the Department of Humanities at Michigan Technology University in Houghton. In 2021, he received an Academy of American Poets Laureate Fellowship from the Academy of American Poets. And as he explained, he is Poet Laureate for 2021 and 2022. I asked him how he pronounces his last name, and he answered like the bird, seagull. And I think that's very appropriate. A seagull calling out on the cold shores of Lake Superior. In fact, one of my favorite poems of his is Lake Superior, and I hope he reads it tonight. Let's welcome M. Bartley Seigel.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for having me. Am I coming through okay on audio?
Yeah.
David, would it be possible to get screen sharing privileges? I should have asked you that earlier. I could put the poems up on the screen as I read them. People in your group may find that kind of interesting to be able to see on the page some of what's going on in the reading. If not, no problem.
You're muted, Dave. You have privileges, Matt.
Thank you.
Here we are.
There we are. There, can everybody see that?
Yeah.
I find in these Zoom readings, sometimes it's kind of entertaining to have the poem to look at and follow along as I read. And sometimes I read quite far afield from the upper Midwest, and especially when you get overseas or you're with English as second language speakers, I'm told my accent is particularly strange and thick. So I've taken to having these slides with me when I read. So yeah, my name's M. Bartley Seigel, Matt Seigel. I'm up in Houghton, Michigan, in the Keweenaw Peninsula, home of Michigan Tech. I'm actually in the Writing Center here at Michigan Tech that I direct. Seemed like a safer, slightly more calm space than to give a reading tonight than my home. So thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be able to kind of zoom down to Ann Arbor and from all these miles away and be with you tonight. So I'm going to start out this evening with a poem called Land Acknowledgement, 1842 Territory. Most of you are probably familiar with the phenomena of land acknowledgements at this point in time. It's mostly an institutional ritual originated in North America universities are particularly fond of doing these sports teams. And they are just an acknowledgement of the traditional kind of Aboriginal lands upon which, our settler colonialist institutions rest. And I was invited by the Keweenaw Bay Indian community in Michigan Tech back in 2017 to start work on drafting a land acknowledgement for Michigan Technological University. But I kind of quickly became pretty disillusioned with the process. It sort of struck me as somewhat of an empty gesture. We weren't doing a lot at Tech to bring in Indigenous students or fund Indigenous scholarships and that sort of thing. And I wasn't happy with the kind of legalese of institutional land acknowledgements. And this is a poem that kind of originated out of that process for me. There's a couple things in the poem I can kind of cue you into. One is a book by a guy named Michael Vitkin called The Infinity of Nations, which, if you are into Indigenous history at all in North America, is a really excellent book. And in the third stanza, there's some Seven Fires prophecy language, and a lot of sentiment in this poem owes a lot of allegiance to Robin Wall Kimmer's chapter or essay, In the Footsteps of Nana Bourgeot, Becoming Indigenous to Place, where she talks about becoming not Indigenous, but actually naturalized to a specific piece of land. I've been living in the Western UP, banging around the UP for about 25 years now, and I do a lot of work with my friends and neighbors, the Keweenaw Bay Indian community, and there is some Anishinaabe in here, some Ojibwe. The phrase Zagakwe Jain, which is translated in poem, it means the forest is dense where you are going. And there are three tree names, Wigwas, Gishik, and Mononoons, which are cedar, birch, cedar, and ironwood, respectively. And that'll kind of help position the poem. And the language I had help with Howard Kimawan from KBIC, who's a native elder and fluent language speaker, who helped me out with that. Land acknowledgement, 1842 territory. I should probably also add, for those of you that don't know, that the place where I live in the Keweenaw Peninsula is 1842 treaty territory. So everything west of the Escanaba River in Michigan, northern Wisconsin, and up into the Arrowhead of Minnesota was Treaty of 1842. You folks downstate have different treaty territories that you're part of, but mine is 1842 treaty territory. Land acknowledgement, 1842 territory. Rooted in song, these infinite nations under cathedral woodland dome, boundless, deep as memory, tall as a story. Spun moon to sun, salt to sweet water sea, winter from autumn, summer from springtime, leaf and needle dancing around the drum, sugar bush to trout stream to goodberry. Together now, Zagakwe Jen, the forest is dense where you are going. Then snake, the booze hag jig, the winking eye. Mowed down to cord and plow, built mine and rail, burnt bar and blade. Give an inch, give a mile, give a swollen river of blood. Got shot and whitewashed, we still can't find the beat, and no one can flourish atop this land acknowledgement. This path is black and charred. Together now, Zagakwe Jen, the forest is dense where you are going. Patience as weapon, wheel, and medicine. In the hushed stillness of the seventh dawn, we will paddle toward the east as one. Backs bent forth to an island green and lush, between the crow's return and chorus frog, gather up mother's tongue, wigwas, gishik, mononoons, no such thing as a trash tree. Together now, Zagakwe Jen, the forest is dense where you are going. Just checking in on the chat. sure I don't miss anything. That's been an interesting poem to read around the country. Land acknowledgements read very differently, whether you're reading at a tribal council meeting or you're reading at a university or you're reading someplace where maybe folks don't have an enormous amount of contact with indigenous Americans. It's been fascinating. Yeah, Phyllis comments in the comments about the refrain, the forest is dense where you were going. I encountered that phrase there's a website, it's a dictionary resource for Anishinaabe-Moan, which is all of the languages in pretty much the Great Lakes Basin, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, Menominee to a lesser extent, Odawa, called the Ojibwe People's Dictionary. And in the Ojibwe People's Dictionary, they give these oftentimes these little idiomatic phrases. And I just randomly came across this phrase, the Gakwaejain, the forest is dense where you were going. I had a good childhood friend who was a tribal member from Manitoulin Island. He passed away a few years ago, but he used to call me up, and the first words out of his mouth were always, "Where you at?" Which I sort of remember now as this sort of call to acknowledge the land. And then he was a deep thinker and loved to talk complicated issues. And he would always caution, be careful where you go with this. And I came across this phrase, and it really reminded me of him. And it's such a beautiful concept. And yeah, it was really that Zagakwaejain, the forest is dense where you're going, was to a large degree kind of the genesis of the poem. The poem has appeared in a lot of different versions. The version of it that appeared in About Place, I think, was the first place that published it, and I think it appears on the both poetry.org and the Academy of American Poets page as an earlier version where I had written it as 2 linked sonnets, and this is a more kind of updated version, more representative of some of the work that I'm doing currently. So, being a living poet, I'm fortunate. I get to my poetics gets to stay alive too. So I do all my poems. I dropped this in a reading recently, just kind of off the cuff. You know how sometimes your mouth gets out ahead of you, and you say things that you haven't really thought through. And I said in passing that I thought actually all my poetry at this point in time, all my poems were land acknowledgements. This idea that we are of the land, we're part of the land, the land is part of us, and the more we kind of put roots down into it, the more we kind of naturalize to the land that we live on. But I'm, of course, like probably many of you in the room, I'm the product of settler colonialism. And I was recently asked by some Estonian relatives. My wife is Estonian. My wife and my kids are Estonian citizens. I was asked by Estonians, an Estonian friend, what I was, what my pedigree papers had written on them, and I had a hard time answering. I come from kind of hardworking class people in the dead center of the mitten from Montcalm County. I grew up near a little location called Coral. And I basically, if they were, Western Northern Europeans who came to the States in the late 1800s, if you shake the bush hard enough, some of those genes are crawling out. I didn't grow up with a really well-defined kind of hyphenated European American identity. there's German. The last name is Ashkenazi. It's actually Seigel. Although there haven't, to my knowledge, there's been no practicing Judaism in my family for many generations. But yeah, there's Norwegians and Swedes and Latvians and Croatians and you name it. My people clearly got around. So this is the poem that kind of came out of thinking through this this issue of identity. And the first line, the title and the first line of the poem, "Body is burning bush, all the snakes crawling out," is sort of a reference to that. But it quickly becomes this sort of identity as place, and identity as identification with the natural world. I think you'll see that in the poem. Body is burning bush, all the snakes crawling out. Blue moon and a sacred grove. Other times, the eyesore, spore along the track. Lunar phasing, I'm pacing, placing found feathers into an old coffee can. B, leaning into the waves, shoulders bent to the paddle. Heart as red squirrel twitching and wary. Heart as the rain-swollen creek eating the earth. Heart as an agate, lake polished, found, then skipped back across the water. That notion of the hard work, which I increasingly find myself using that phrase, shoulders bent to the paddle. I do a lot of canoeing and canoe camping, and canoeing is a big part of the traditional culture up here in my part of Michigan, and a lot of canoes and canoeists and canoe culture and canoe songs, and that idea of rowing and bending into the wind and bending one's back to the paddle and doing the hard work. You'll see that pop up a few times in the poems that I'm going to read tonight.
Have you canoed on the Ontonagon River?
I have canoed on the Ontonagon River. I've done most of the big rivers in the UP. My favorite haunt right now is Sylvania Wilderness. I much prefer lake paddling to river paddling. It's much less arduous. I do less damage to my equipment and gear. I'm not as talented a paddler as I am an enthusiast of paddling. And I keep gravitating more towards lake paddling, but I love Sylvania Wilderness, and I spend a lot of time in the McCormick Track and Craig Lake, the Craig Lakes and the Barriga chain of lakes, and I get up to Isle Royale at least once a season as well. Yeah, Sylvania Wilderness is special. Yeah, the creek eating the earth. I live on a street called Agate Street in Houghton. Back in 2018, we had a big rain event, one of these 1,000-year flood events, and Agate Street washed out. And if you remember that event, or you saw footage in the news of all the mudslides that we had up here in the Keweenaw, it was pretty astounding. And my street, when they put in the mines and they built the town, they didn't really care much for topography or geology or hydrology or anything else. They just kind of put things wherever they needed them to be. And Agate Street runs through an old drainage. So it was only a matter of time before we had a big rain event, and the drainage kind of reclaimed itself from the road. But that notion of the rain swollen creek eating the earth, and the way that models sometimes emotional states is something I keep kind of being drawn back to. I think the way the natural disasters resonate with people is very indicative of sometimes our internal landscapes. Yeah, Isle Royale is very special to me. Of course, it's my local park. Park headquarters is right in Houghton. I did some poetry programming for the park this summer, so I got to go and read poetry on the Ranger, which is the park boat that goes out to the island from Houghton, and I got to give a reading in Rock Harbor, which is one of the main ports of entry. And every time I'm out on the island, it's a really special experience. And this is a poem that comes right off the island. So good, George, that you mentioned how much you love it. So here's an Isle Royale poem for you. This was a poem that came out of a canoe trip that I took with my son this last summer. Hushville, and still closer comes the red fox and chickadee, the turning of thistle and thorn. I reach up into memory, tidally locked and phasing like moon glow overhead, or down into the greenstone, billions of years beneath the trillium. I've scant to say that's not already sung by the wind in the balsam and cedar, or the stones at the bend of the river. The steady beat of our own wolfish hearts, the chorus that is starshine in our eyes, the land that speaks when we've ears to listen. And I have a few more poems in the pile today that are Isle Royale poems. I turned 48 this year, which I'm sure will seem young to some of you, and to my children seems perilously old. I'm very near death to my kids. But I am finding in my middle age, in the great gray sweep of my 40s, busy with my career and my family and being UP Poet Laureate and all the various hats that I wear, that I am increasingly drawn to this notion of stillness. I don't have an enormous amount of stillness in my life at present, but I find a great deal of it when I'm outside. Nature's very close. In Houghton, it's very easy to get out into the bush and get away from people. You do not have to travel far to be out in something that looks and smells and tastes a lot like wilderness. And I retreat to that a lot. And this poem really came out of a attempt to sort of initiate my 15-year-old son, who does not have a lot of patience for his dad's poetry, to kind of initiate my 15-year-old son into this notion of quietude and hushfulness and stillness and patience. And the poem really came out of that. I took a canoe trip with him up to the island this summer, and this poem came out of that experience. George asked if the wolfish hearts refer to Isle Royale's wolves. It does. Specifically, though, I have to admit that when I first drafted this poem, I used the phrase bearish hearts. The metaphor of wolfishness or bearishness, of course, is very different. It means very, very different things in English and further abroad. And I wasn't actually sure if I wanted the symbolism of the wolf for this poem, but because it came off Isle Royale, it just worked so well. And I'm learning in my poetry that the charismatic species play well in poetry, and it fit really well. Yeah, definitely Keith Taylor's land. I hope, have you all, if any of you have not, Keith has this wonderful little chapbook of Isle Royale poems that are just absolutely beautiful. These absolutely beautiful little postcards from Isle Royale. And Keith has been a mentor of mine for many years. And there's a lot of Keith banging around in my poetry. So this is a strange little poem. This one this one came out of a friend of mine down at KBIC, a guy by the name of Jerry Jandreau, who runs an outfit called Dynamite Hill Farms. They do a lot of sugar bushing and traditional ricing. And he spent one winter about 2 winters ago teaching his young girls how to snare rabbits in the traditional way. And they weren't having much luck because, of course, there's a lot of luck involved in snaring rabbits successfully. And he finally taught these 2 young kids how to set these snares, and they caught their first snowshoe hare. And he had posted this picture of them getting ready to make rabbit stew with this rabbit that they had caught in the snare. And I found the whole thing very moving. And so I wrote Jerry this poem called Rabbit Snares, and it's written along the syllable count mirrors the Fibonacci number sequence up through a certain number of digits, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, and so on, up through that last line. You can't take it too far because you end up with these just gargantuan lines. But I like this idea of you know, the sort of spinning out in cosmology, and some of the imagery worked really well. It's not, I don't tend to work in forms like this very often. I find them to sometimes to be a little too on the nose, but it just fits so well. So this is a poem called Rabbit Snares. Small hands taught well to set snares carefully along the path. Rabbit is a person of ceremony, just like you and me. Movable, this feast under a blazing Milky Way. When he trips the noose, his reciprocity opens a small hole in space-time through which a murmuration of ancestors pour, their words, gratitude in whatever language they whisper. Rabbit snares. For any of you that have never snared rabbits, that line about rabbits being creatures of habit, they move in what are called runs. They make a path through the snow, and they tend to stick to the same path over and over again. So you don't have to find the rabbits; you just have to find their paths, and then you set the snare there. But it resonates a lot with me because I'm also a creature of the rut. And I find myself moving through the same paths all the time.
When I saw the shape of this poem, I thought it might resemble a snare when it's laid out.
It could. I'll own that if you'll let me. It could. Yeah, it's mostly the sort of the cosmology of it, shape of the Milky Way.
Mm-hmm.
Ancestors are up in the stars.
Hmm.
And I work a lot with, again, it's probably just a function of where I'm at in my life, but I find myself increasingly, a lot of my poetics working around ideas of reciprocity and you know, circularity, gratitude, and some of those notions that I have not always, as a man, I have not always been a great example of, but you try to do better. This originally appeared at Poetry Magazine. This is probably for you poets in the room. You kind of understand what that means. It's probably my one and done poem for Poetry Magazine. I actually tried to get Poetry to print the land acknowledgement poem, but they had just come through a couple of scandals with identity politics and some poets kind of misrepresenting work in a particular way, and they were really uncomfortable with me putting Anishinaabe Moan on the page, and they settled on this love poem instead. And so I'm pretty proud of that. This came out of my wife's, a few years back. We were sitting down having a drink one evening, and she asked me why I never wrote her any love poems. And she asked what the point of being married to a poet, if she wasn't going to get any love poems. And she was quick to add the aside, it's certainly not the money. And so I sat down. Valentine's Day was right around the corner, and I sat down and tried to write. I tried to write some love poems, and I don't know about you folks, but every time I try to write a love poem, I can't. And so like I usually do, I ended up kind of writing a love poem to place that inadvertently and luckily for me, became a love poem to my wife. This phrase in the bone cracking cold also comes from an Ojibwe sort of idiomatic phrase. The Ojibwe have a lot of language to describe various conditions of cold in the deep kind of storytelling months of winter. And I really loved, if you walk through the woods in January and February, and the trees are just cracking and creaking, and it's just bitter cold. It's a idiom that hits close. In the bone cracking cold. On this cross quarter day, quick to temper and cool, your long lashes startle me with a rhyme of hoarfrost, and I am snared like a rabbit, pulled into your gravity by nature of our long love affair. The seasons race by, one after another, rising sap soon to halo the maples again. But I would freeze in the bone-cracking cold just to watch you walk slowly through the sugar bush, rare as a sundog, incandescent in the softly falling snow forever. That's one of my favorite ones. If you write enough, and you're serious about your process, you create a lot of garbage.
Put that last poem back again, David.
Every once in a while, a good one comes out.
Okay.
The next one, this one, or that one. Oh, sorry, I'm screwing up here. That one?
No, the one, the love poem.
Cracking cold.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, good.
Don't be discouraged by the total lack of sound here. If you look at the chat, you're getting accolades and beautifuls.
Etched in gemstone and antler. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. A sugar bush is a stand of maple trees from which maple syrup is harvested. So if you have a farm where you're making maple syrup, they refer to that as a sugar bush. Sugar bush is also another term for choke cherries. Sometimes stands of choke cherry get called a sugar bush as well. Etched in gemstone and antler. The past won't hear our apologies, and the future needs more than these few words. Amid the gathering silence, safe in our most basic selves, our hearts release their sacred holdings, little haloed echoes etched in gemstone and antler. Still, we find traces of laughter in the night sky, feeling like a season following forest fire. A lot of my poetry I'm increasingly finding are in some part an attempt to answer to my daughter's hopelessness about like the Anthropocene and global climate change and all of the kind of environmental stuff that beset us these days. And it's for other parents in the room, it's well, for any human being, hopelessness is a hard thing to speak to and to encourage people out of. But this was a poem that kind of came out of that process and trying to think about how we see beyond the immediate crises to a place that could potentially be better. One of my favorite poems is Gary Snyder's For the Children, that ends with that line about, over the rising slope of statistics, there's a field, we'll meet there, go light, learn the flowers, stay together. Which he takes from an old Rumi poem, that notion of the field out beyond good and evil, and if we make it, we'll meet there together. And this was very much a poem which was trying to sort of speak to that longer vision of time that, of course, an 18-year-old has a hard time grappling with, and where we find hope and where we look to for inspiration. Fool Spring. We get what up here we call Fool Spring is usually a nice weekend in early March or late February, where we suddenly get this warming trend in the weather, and the sun comes out, and everybody's stormy chromers and parkas go away for a day, and we're all frolicking around outside like it's about to be spring. And then the next morning it's 30 below and the snow's blowing sideways. We always refer to those days as Fool's Spring. Fool Spring. I've taken to long walks with Walt, the dog ambling ahead, long and lean, one torn page of mud song at a turn. A flame along the salmon trout and swift down to Frida. The forest creeps rebellious through crack and crevice, where a wreck of smokestack mumbles through a mouthful of stars. High above in the nave, a blue jay's the psalm. Steal the day, he sings, and hold on tightly to each other. The salmon trout is a little river near Houghton. Frida is an old stamp mill town on the west side of the Keweenaw Peninsula, and there is a smokestack there that you can climb up into and lay down on the floor of it and look up through the kind of the barrel of the smokestack. And when we were young, we used to like to go out there with a bottle of wine and lay down and watch the stars come up through the hole in the smokestack. Smokestack mumbles through a mouthful of stars.
Forgive me.
I'm sorry.
I heard you say a rack of whole stack, and you're written wreck, which is
wreck of smokestack. Another Isle Royal poem for you. Lane Cove is up on the northeast side of the island. There's an archipelago, Five Finger Bay, and this archipelago of islands up off the northeast side of the island, which is a really beautiful place to canoe. It could be quite treacherous, but very beautiful. Belle Isle used to be a resort back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, up through about the 1920s. There's a 3-hole golf course on Belle Isle. There was a lodge and some little cabins, and it was a place where people went to get away from their seasonal allergies, I'm told. We were canoeing back from Belle Isle into Lane Cove, and and we had this experience. Lane Cove sirens. We paddled out from Belle Isle at dawn, bellies bulging with lake trout, beards glistening with the grease, pleased as punch behind our teeth, beneath our strong backs, able before the gathering gods, and slid before the gale into the sudden calm of the cove. Then a sound, a ricochet off the water, some flute note from the forest, or a stray breeze playing along a fishing line somewhere between gunwale and the rippling water. And again, soft, submelodic, something just out of reach. Can you hear it? For an hour, we floated in the gathering dark, branches bent to drift and loon call, into and out of the mystery, silently searching the crystal depths between log jam and moose bone to savvy, but finding only our own goose flesh and grateful for it. Another one of what I've come to refer to as the gratitude poems. We're starting to edge into my 50 minutes here, so I'm going to scroll through and hit a couple high points. The second of the two kind of wolf specific poems. We currently have a pretty healthy wolf population in the Western UP. It's not impossible to hear them singing, especially if you're out in the McCormick Track. But this is from the Delirium Wilderness, which is in the Eastern UP, just south of Sault Ste. Marie, south and a little west of Sault Ste. Marie, between the Sioux and St. Ignace. Wolf hymn. Wandering in delirium wilderness until blood orange behind the white pine. Cumulus boiling black up off the big lake north, nightfall, bush click, a little old crow and a lip match. When the first wolf spirits her prelude skyward, we jump from our skins, slither up alongside the node into starburst and a rising antlered moon, pay our ancestors amid the thunder and void. Then polyphonic, the pack of them, their chorus swelling back into our darkest tunnels where we have bellied down to listen in a language almost forgotten, but not lost. Have time for a couple more, David? Am I still good?
Yeah, I think that's fine. We started late.
This was a poem that originally appeared in the Michigan Quarterly Review, actually, and has been anthologized a little bit. And is another one of these kind of hope poems. As I mentioned earlier, I come from pretty hard working class folks down in Montcalm County, and I live in a part of the state that is pretty hard scrabble if you get a few feet off the main road, and I'm always kind of taken with the richness of lives foundationed on very little, and kind of where hope and joy and happiness and thriving come from when there's not a lot of economic mobility underpinning it. This is doubly, so there's that aspect to the poem, but doubly I'm really fascinated by human artifactuality in nature. So you travel across the UP and one would be forgiven for believing you're driving through kind of untrammeled wilderness a lot of the times, but you're always driving through second or third or fourth growth forest. Most of the UP was mowed down to rebuild Chicago after the fire. It's been mined and burned and blasted, and anywhere in the bush, anywhere you go in the UP, no matter how far out in the sticks you get, you're never more than about 100 feet from a ruin or an old road or a 2-track. And I've just always been fascinated by the sort of human artifactuality reclaimed by nature. All my friends are agate hounds. They spend days on Lake Superior looking for agate stones, or they're combing the beach on Isle Royale for greenstones. But I always find myself looking for beach glass. I find it, I find the historicity of it and the way in which nature has taken something that's kind of sharp and jagged and ugly and dangerous and turned it into this beautiful thing again. That gives me a lot of hope for humanity in general. Those are kind of the two big ideas banging around in this poem. Beach glass. Shivering in the morning light, we gather like cigarette butts at the water's edge, our 1,000 naked bodies in a long chain bent from burden and burnt to the filter. What we've learned. Scars are replaced with more scars, and hair grows up from scorched earth. Once, we would have cut ourselves with broken glass so the wind might rush through the breach to line us with fallen limbs and leaves. But beach sand has since worn dull the sharper edges of our pain. Stomachs empty and growling, we've come at last to these shores, copper-wired gear and pulley, all coiled spring and iron will, our words tin-typed on our tongues. We clasp arms and dive in together, electric and beautiful as bullets. We disappear beneath the lake's surface for what seems a grateful eternity, knowing somewhere out beyond the tree line's dark reflection, where the water is cool and clean and clear, the long arc of a sandbar awaits us.
Mhm.
And I think I had Edward, did someone requested Lake Superior?
Yeah, I did, yes.
So we'll end on that one. There is most people are familiar with the petroglyphs up in Ottawa Bay on the Canadian side of the lake, north of the Sioux. Those types of petroglyphs and various other carvings are all over the stone line bringing Lake Superior. And if you walk the shore at all and you're careful, you're gonna come across something that was put into the rock hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of years ago. And I always find those meetings to be very powerful moments. And so there's up near Copper Harbor at the tip of the Keweenaw Peninsula, there's a little rock carving of a bear that I like to visit quite a bit. And it overlooks Lake Superior near Horseshoe Bay on the northwestern side of the Keweenaw Peninsula. And this was a poem that kind of came out of one of these sort of cathartic experiences on the lakeside, watching a storm come in. Lake Superior. Under my hand, a stone bear in nesting circles carved by ancestors. Behind me, the walking woods at dusk, feather and fur, the little stone, moss, and mushroom people. We all still and hush to look and listen. Beyond the barrier islands and reefs, where the sun sets blood red and thunderbirds brew black and quickening, the abyssal heartbeat spirits deep within the bedrock upon which all of the dreaming is sown. I would call you by your first given name, Anishinaabegchgami. I would make this offering on this ground, but what are words against the coming gale?
Yeah. Wonderful incantation.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for reading.
You're very welcome.
You brought us on a trip to the UP.
I hope so. That's one of my goals. I was a big fan for most of my young manhood, for reasons that were probably not super great. I was a big fan of Jim Harrison's work and especially of his poetry. I love Jim's poetry, and he wrote, one of the last things that Jim wrote was this little piece for the New York Times called My UP, or My Upper Peninsula. And it just was a maddening little piece of drivel, and which I think Jim would appreciate hearing if he were around to hear it. He had a good sense of humor about his own work and himself. But in some ways, I feel like I'm always kind of responding to that last little essay by Jim Harrison from the New York Times. I want people to see the UP like I see the UP.
Mhm.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Matt.
All right, thank you. Yes.